believe when I'm looking into these particular stories for you that I want to speak to the people that were there. That's how, to me, is the vital thing. You can read things in newspapers, online, whatever. People offer informed opinions, and people, of course, are commentaries, aren't they? You know, oh, this is what I think. But when you talk to the people that were there, to me, that is the most important piece. And I've been lucky enough, as many people know, to meet so many people along the way. And of course, when you look back at some of the interviews and stuff, and you talk to people again, and you realise that actually they were there, so they would know what truly went on. To me, that's more interesting than anybody's opinion. And as we recently celebrated the 20th anniversary of His Majesty the King, King Charles III, and of course Queen Camilla, their 20th anniversary, as I pointed out recently, I couldn't quite believe it was 20 years since I was stood outside there with the camera crew so early in the morning. I'll never forget that, you know. And literally we were there all day for this celebration. But the rocky road along to their romance, as we all know the backstory, but even on the day, things weren't exactly going to plan. So today I wanted to share with you some of the memories that I've curated, literally from speaking and working with those people that actually attended the royal wedding of Charles and Camilla. Hi, good morning, good evening, whatever you're doing. Welcome to a brand new episode of By Royal Appointment. This is, of course, the show where we delve a little bit deeper into the stories that matter to you. I share with you inside stuff that lots of people have no idea about because they weren't there, they haven't interviewed those people. And that's what I love about By Royal Appointment. And thank you so much, by the way, for all of your support that you've given the longer version so far. I truly am appreciative. It does take a lot of work. Yes, you're right, chums. You've got to do a lot more effort and find these things and talk to people again and all that sort of stuff. But it's great because it gets the old brain matter going, doesn't it? You think, oh, right, you know, forgot about that, even though you were there. Yes, you see, what I think, my memory, by the way, of the Charles and Camilla wedding was literally how much business they brought to Windsor. And I don't know if you'd get this now, and I don't mean that disrespectfully to them, but, you know, it was a different time. There were no iPhones, you know, social media wasn't around. So every camera crew had to come from somewhere in the world and they were all booking their spaces. And I don't know if you know this, but when they have a big event like, say, Harry and Meghan's wedding or the Platinum Jubilee, the spaces around those areas can go for thousands of pounds. Incredible money, you know. If you've got a hotel, say, in Windsor with a balcony, that could be £10,000 a day. And then, of course, you've got the accommodation, and then you've got the drink and the food and the crew and the makeup and everything. It wouldn't happen, you know, because now people will either do it independently, sell it to you, or just shrink it all down, because the mainstream media, as we know, is shrinking down and they just don't have the money. But back then, people were spending a lot of money, including the organisation that I was working for at the time that sent me to cover the royal wedding. And I was really excited, you know, I mean, thought, wow, this is an historical event. And I got there really early because I think it was still quite dark at that period, you know. I know it was April time, but it seemed to be, maybe I just got there early, it seemed to be in the middle of the night, and I thought, what are we doing, you know? And as I mentioned previously, the wonderful Castle Hotel had put on some sort of breakfast and coffee and stuff like that, and I thought, oh, this is quite nice, very civil at this point, you know. And what was fascinating, as I say, looking back at the royal wedding, I didn't realise that I was sat on a lot of information. And this is all thanks to this particular lady, the brilliant late comedienne, Joan Rivers. Now, I've known Joan, or should I say I'd known Joan a long time by then. We'd worked together over at LWT. And what was interesting about Joan was that when she came over to London, very quickly she became a favourite with the then Prince of Wales, Prince Charles. See, she'd done loads of jokes about him. And of course, Diana included, for many years, over on the Johnny Carson show, and then independently on a Fox show and stuff like that. And she was just very savvy. She knew exactly what worked and all that sort of stuff. But what I liked about Joan, and as I said, known her for years, and that particular picture, I think was on the 4th or 5th time that we'd worked together. Just a lovely lady, and she said, well, you know, do you want to come for a drink? And that's where we were leaving the studios at that point, you know. But she talked about meeting Diana for the first time. And what was interesting about her version of events was the fact that, you know, she pointed out that Princess Diana at this point, because she met her in a thing, I'd have to search this out for you, in fact, but it was a big event somewhere in Chicago, and Diana naturally was the star guest, looked stunning, looked beautiful. And as John pointed out to me, you know, she felt such a sort of like, oh, next to this beautiful woman. But Diana just made her at ease, was nice, polite, friendly, and they got on very well. And you see, the thing apparently about how they got on was, the fact that really, I think Diana knew that humour was the key to getting out of things. Joan apparently said, according to her, these are her words, look, just move on with your life. You have to, so this is a drawing line, this is where you're at. Find a way out, get comedy if you have to do it. You're one of the most beautiful women in the world. What have you got to worry about? Everything's going in your way. And Diana said, she wrote her a letter afterwards sort of saying, your positivity should be bottled because you're just so good at taking people's emotions and saying, don't worry, it will be fine. But as Joan pointed out, it's easier, isn't it, to give the advice than to actually take it. But she said she really did believe that Diana did take that advice. And they had a correspondence for a while. And, Joan said that she was a lovely lady who sort of wanted affirmation from the basic things of, is my hair too short? Should I go back to having it long? She said, I think that was part of a problem. She'd got this big arena of explosion of, power. And really, she didn't think there was anybody around her because, of course, she wasn't Hollywood. She was royal. But their friendship developed, and over the years, as I said, they got on. Yes, she's pointed out to me, Joan, there were conversations about Camilla. She always called her Mrs. Parker Bowles. She said she was never disrespectful at all to Camilla. She just, this was Joan's version of it. She said she just felt that she was baffled as to why, and I guess, what the true story is that you either love somebody or you don't, and that might either cause a lot of I get all of that, but that was Joan's thing. As she said, she'd been dumped more times than a jacket potato. So the thing was, that made Diana laugh. She said, look, that's life. That's it. And she said, that Diana loved her life, her children. They were the epicenter to her. And she said she was just one of these hands-on mums that wanted to make the world a better place. And she loved all the stuff that she did behind the scenes. Now, the relationship with Prince Charles and Joan Rivers developed, according to Joan, simply because they had a love of watercolour painting. But as Joan said to me, it wasn't necessarily my first love. She said, I liked the idea of it, but, she said she wasn't very good at it. But then she got an invite, after being at a royal event in England, to go on this watercolour weekend with the then Prince of Wales. And she said, I came up, I've got the makeup artist, the hair's all done, all of this sort of stuff. She said, all the other women looking effortlessly beautiful with no hassle at all. And she said, and I'm thinking, oh gosh, I've got all this stuff, And she said, suddenly I realised I was a comedy skit again because she couldn't get the easel up. And, she said, Charles was just kindness itself. They got on like a house on fire. And what Joan pointed out was that Charles has this fabulous sense of humour. I know a lot of people say that, but she said, he was very attuned to American comedy, and he apparently offended Joan by saying he loved Phyllis Diller. And she said, oh, she. And so that's how they broke down the barrier. But, she said that he loved American style comedy. And she found this odd because he also loved The Goons, which was very British in its approach, But obviously, that's what made them bond, all that sort of stuff. Now, what happened again was, as she said, she went on this watercolour thing, and this was Charles's big thing. And they just got friendly. And then after that, she got invited to a private dinner. I think this would be at Highgrove. And she said that's where she met Camilla. And she was a little bit nervous about meeting Camilla because she said, this is Camilla and the way she'd been painted in the media. But she was a totally different person. And Joan pointed out that she said if she could have found a man who looked at her the way Charles looked at Camilla, then she would have been 100% happy. She said, I thought, this is it. This is a royal romance. This is the thing. And nobody asked her at all about her connection with Diana, didn't want to intrude, but Joan brought it up and said, I do know Diana. And Charles basically said, I hope she's doing well, and never negative at all about her, As she pointed out, there was no stabbing of, she's a nuisance or whatever. None of that. just ultra positive. And she didn't believe he was acting. She just believed that this was a man who was, very comfortable in his life where he was. She also pointed out that she saw Harry and William very close and very friendly with Camilla. She said that they got on well. She said, yes, there was this sort of, like teenagers are at that point, uncomfortable around adults. But she said, essentially they got on well, they were laughing a lot and they got a lot of the jokes. So consequently, this goes against the grain of what Harry was saying about being younger and they didn't want him to marry her and stuff. That's not the imagery that I got told to me, as you can understand. I also remember about the wedding of Charles and Camilla was the real mood of the country. If it wasn't exactly like a mega royal wedding, and up until that build-up there'd been a lot of negative headlines. And let's not forget, they'd not been exactly very popular in the media for a long time. But one thing that you have to remember, and I think this is very important, is Her Majesty the Queen, the late Queen, Queen Elizabeth, knew that her eldest child was not going to be giving in. And according to sources, she quite liked that, because the thing really about Charles was he'd really made up his mind. And there were sort of rumours and things swirling around that he'd been advised that perhaps he should wait a little longer before, he eventually got married to Camilla. And he said, when is there a good time? Neither of us are getting any younger. And when you think about it now, and you look at that, you think, well, 20 years has gone very quickly. If they'd have waited another 20, where would they truly be? This was a destined royal romance, whichever way you look at it. But again, what's interesting is Her Majesty the Queen very quickly relented because she knew that he wanted to go ahead with this. And very quietly and very gently, Camilla and, of course, the Queen built bridges between them. And people might say, well, this must have been incredibly difficult. They'd known each other on the peripheral for many years. Now, don't forget that the Queen got on incredibly well with the late and beautiful Princess Diana. They had a very good, strong relationship. The thing was that there were two women of two different generations. And, while the Queen understood Diana a lot, as she did, of course, with Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, and she tried to help all the women within the royal, sort of circle. She said, look, in the end, you kind of got to make it work for yourselves. And both she and Philip pulled back, because they realised that this was going to be a battle between the two of them, Charles and Diana. And Diana really was going through a very difficult time. And I would say this is part and parcel of the problem of what really went wrong. And I blame, now we know the full extent, this one particular individual. And that is, of course, Martin Bashir. You see, Martin Bashir openly lied to Princess Diana just to get awards, to get exposure, to get himself known as an international interviewer, that sort of stuff. And when you look into the detail, and not all of the detail is out there in the public domain, it is horrific what he did to trick her into that. And truly, it's a very dark story that really should be told, but I think out of respect to both Prince William and even, His Majesty the King and Prince Harry, maybe will never be told. What he did was deplorable, and it's amazing the way that his story has been swept under the carpet because, he lied, he cheated, he faked all sorts of things in order to make her believe an absolute tissue of lies. So you can understand that while the Queen was trying to balance this out, she had no idea all of these lies were being fed by this man from the BBC that she had no idea about with that interview. And I'm not making excuses here, chums. I'm just saying time tells us a different story. That's the thing. A deplorable man, really, who should be held to account. Incredible that the BBC carried on paying him for so long, but that is another story. But back to happier times. Well, on that wedding day, what I do remember was there was a lot of stories about, will this person, when they come out the car, will they be booed? Will they be this? There was nothing of the sort. It was a very joyous event, in fact. And what I do remember, apart from quite a few of the celebrities naturally turning up, because we were covering it in a fully sort of way as an entertainment thing rather than actually a royal event, which seems strange in a sense. Perhaps it was more palatable, literally, to the general public. But moving forward, the headlines were very positive the day after, and a lot of people really wished, of course, the Prince of Wales all the very best in his new romance. But it was a romance that literally, as I pointed out, literally at the time, it was destined. You couldn't stop it. There were two people that, some say were destined to be together. Now, this lovely lady, Prunella Scales, is known to a lot of people, of course, as being a fabulous, performer in the wonderful TV show Fawlty Towers. And I got to know her quite well, and she said this to me, which was kind of interesting, right? Was the fact that apart from herself, with the wonderful actor Timothy West, who also had a very long and enduring, wonderful, loving marriage, she said she'd never been in an environment where she just felt these two people were incredibly right. And she said, I'm not saying that because I knew them or, I was friends with them. She said, but there was a real sense of joyous happiness. And whatever you thought, whatever, you'd read about, you could not deny the fact that this was, in fact, a wonderful situation to be in. And Prunella, as I said, a lovely, lovely lady going through her own battle personally at the moment, and sadly lost her husband, as we know, recently. But she is just a nice lady who speaks the truth. And this goes back to what I was saying at the very start of this royal appointment. When you talk to the people that were there, not the speculative gossip from a tabloid, this to me is the most important bit. Another stunning lady who was at that wedding, and also a good chum, is none other than my possible favourite new Avenger, sorry Dame Diana Rigg, but none other than the beautiful Joanna Lumley. As I said, I think the key to the successful marriage of Charles and Camilla really is humour. And a good friend of mine, the late and brilliant Barry Humphries, Dame Edna Everett, I love Barry Humphries, as you know, just a genius, Now, both of them absolutely adored his humour. And that tells you a lot, really, about Charles and Camilla. And Barry told me that, the famous sketch that he did in the royal box and everything like that, they had no idea that this was going to happen in advance. They knew something was going to happen, so they said, don't be shocked if the door opens, etc. They had to warn them about that. But Barry said they had no idea just how far he was going to go. Now, of course, he'd known them, so they felt very relaxed in his company. And as he pointed out, it could have gone either way, because obviously, people didn't know what he was going to say or how, in fact, the audience were going to react. But you see, she sort of, and I have to say this, Camilla has this wonderful dark sense of humour. We've seen this even on royal tours where inappropriately, you might say, they get the giggles. But surely that's a good thing, knowing that the person next to you who is just guffawing with laughter, well, the problem that you have then is, how do you stop? Because it's genuinely making them laugh and it's genuinely making you, you know what I mean? So you are you've got to go with it, haven't you? And that really, I would say, is the secret to their friendship, their marriage, and their adoration for each other. Now, as you know, I've been lucky enough to meet members of the family, including her son, Tom Parker Bowles, who's a brilliant food writer. And, what I like about Tom is he's a bit like me, I think he just has a go at food, but then he's lucky because he gets invited to sample all these wonderful restaurants, everything from McDonald's right down to the poshest restaurant going. And he said, what you realise in the end is food, Neil. You either like it or you don't. And it was he that revealed that revelation to me that his mum, Camilla, wasn't exactly, well, she was a good cook, he said, but she didn't make a fuss of food. What was there, leftovers were used up, and a treat might have been a visit to the Wimpy Bar. Certainly weren't spoiled, certainly weren't told this is, what you're going to have. And he feels that this was another thing where, he's been helpful for her. As being the Queen, she has a sense of reality, understands what people are going through. Yes, they have their luxury life, but that is the prerogative of being the King and the Queen. Now, as I mentioned, Joanna Lumley, also a stunning lady, has to be one of the best voiceover voices, do you not think, chums, in the world. Seductive, sultry, and very sexy and beautiful into the bargain, of course, as well. Started life out as a model and, of course, became a James Bond lady. But for me, will always be Purdy in the New Avengers. Many, of course, of my generation will remember her also in that wonderful sci-fi series, Sapphire and Steel. Do you remember that? Look at that now if you can. Very strange, the effects. A little bit on the old budgie side, to say the least. Now, Joanna was one of the very special guests at that wedding way back 20 years ago. And again, she knows the couple very well. And as she pointed out, that basically Charles and Camilla had no choice, in a sense, to push forward with their relationship, because where could it have gone? Now, she got on very well with Diana as well. Joanna Lumley gets on with everybody. And, she's one of these people that can interact, make people feel relaxed. And, is definitely a woman's woman. And she and Diana had a very good, strong relationship. And this is the theme that I've learned, actually, meeting people is, well, the sort of media paint out there was this camp and that camp. Actually, a lot of people were in the both sides. Many were still friends with Prince Charles and Camilla, and many were still friends, of course, with the late beautiful Princess Diana. So when you do look at that, you can understand how, say, Prince Harry has a contrived view of the media. And what was interesting is, and this came from another source at the wedding, was how delighted Harry was, because they remember a very close, warm, caring, laughter-filled relationship with Camilla. And the secret that this person told me was that she didn't want to be a friend, a stepmom or anything. She just was, well, look. And if anything, she was a lot more lenient on him if he was misbehaving as a teenager or backchatting or all of that sort of stuff, because she had got these children herself and knew that this is the period that you go through and you're going to have all that problems with them, but cut them some slack, sort of thing. So if anything, Harry should have been a lot more gracious in the way that Charles brought him up. And as we've seen, there's a one-sided story. And I mentioned this to you before, that the story goes, that basically Meghan and Camilla didn't get on. Well, again, not true. And this has been verified from many different people. Some might suggest this is a more sellable narrative, the wicked stepmother, that sort of thing. But back to Joanna Lumley. Well, she said, again, like so many have reiterated, this is a love story that was meant to be. And some people, as she pointed out, well, the bottom line was, if fate had taken a natural course, this would have been a totally different course of history. And perhaps things would have been, literally totally different. But of course, you have to remember, way back in the 70s, we had, Princess Margaret being rather controversial and shocking with her dates with Roddy Llewellyn on Mustique Beach and all of those things, which I do remember. I was very young, but I remember reading about these things, and they did seem scandalous, because you're thinking, the Queen's sister doing this, But Princess Margaret had rocked the monarchy so many times, people were now oblivious. But what the monarchy wanted in the late 70s and early 80s was to redefine itself. Now, when you think about it, that set of protocol looks so antiquated today. And people say, does the monarchy modernise? Well, look at it. Of course it's modernised. And it modernised when it welcomed a lady of colour into the royal family. It wasn't their fault that this particular lady of colour didn't like them, you see? So where this gets interesting with this story is, and this goes all back to the celebration of 20 years of marriage of Charles and Camilla, there was a totally different time. I do remember reporting on this, as I said, and it was a different sort of period. There were lots of big names there, including Stephen Fry, naturally, the ubiquitous, Elton John, all that sort of stuff. And there was a nice party afterwards, which the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh attended. But everything was done in a low-key level. And that's really, I think, how this has really helped both Charles and Camilla build a respect and a trust with the public, with the Commonwealth. They've been very transparent about what they wanted to do, and consequently, the public feel, well, we should give them a chance. And let's look at what Camilla has actually done. A lot of good charitable work with the refuge ladies, with the book clubs, with numerous other behind-the-scenes charities. And I know for a fact, and I can tell you this, that there's a lot of work, phone calls, Zooms, that they do that you don't see in the public eye. And this is, to me, where the real value comes in, because there may be a one-to-one with somebody who's going through an incredibly difficult time, and they do what they can to rectify that and move it in a different direction. So as we look and say, wow, where did 20 years of Charles and Camilla go? Well, that's really sort of it. That is the story. But it's a story taken from people who were there, who literally reported on it, and who were guests at that wedding. So when you read these other sort of the stories of saying, oh, they weren't happy, or Harry and William didn't want him to marry her and stuff like that, I would take all of that with a huge pinch of salt, because the varying stories that I've had from people who were working there, literally in the moment at that time, well, where this came from, maybe that was a thought in Prince Harry's head, but it certainly was never reiterated to anybody around those people at that time. And as I often say, it should be that. The truth is the story. Seemingly sometimes the truth can get lost for either dollars or indeed delusion. As I said previously, I think it's fair to say that the wonderful comedian Joan Rivers put it best really when she said, "Time changes everything," to quote, as she pointed out, that now famous Mac and Mabel song. And as she also pointed out, well, really, King Charles, Prince Charles, whatever we now call him, because I always want to call him Prince Charles, well, the bottom line really for him is this was clearly going to be his destiny. And as Joan pointed out, as well as many other the celebrities that attended on that day over 20 years ago now, this is a royal love story, whether people want to agree with it or not. And it's spectacular to think, isn't it, that all of these years down the line, this has proven to be a very fruitful relationship. Not only that, they seem to be the very best of chums, and as Joan very tearfully one night pointed out, in a joking but actually slightly serious way, she said, wouldn't everybody really like a prince to come your way, sweep you off your feet, go and live in a wonderful castle or a palace, and everything be a happy ending? And as she said to me not too long before she sadly passed away herself, she said, really, it is a fairy tale of our time. And when you think about it, she's not really far wrong, is she? But thank you for taking the time out to watch the latest episode of By Royal Appointment. And as ever, please be kind, comment, like and share if you can. Neil Sean in the very heart of London.